In the depths of an ancient temple, where shadows dance between towering columns of stone. Where hieroglyphs glow like secrets waiting to be told, where the whispers of eternity echo through corridors that have witnessed the rise and fall of gods and kings, there is a voice. A voice that speaks of power beyond imagination. A voice that tells of women who defied the very fabric of time itself. In a land ruled by gods and kings, rose women who defied time itself. Their names were buried. Their power, erased. Until now. Listen, can you hear them? The footsteps of queens walking through the halls of history? The rustle of royal linen, the clink of golden jewelry, the soft murmur of voices that once commanded armies, built temples, and shaped the destiny of the greatest civilization the world has ever known? These are the lost queens of Egypt. Their stories have been hidden beneath centuries of sand, their faces chiseled from monuments, their names scratched from the sacred lists of pharaohs. But stone remembers what men forget. And today we uncover their truth. Picture, if you will, the world as it was 5,000 years ago. In Mesopotamia, women were property. In Greece, they were confined to their homes. In Rome, they existed at the mercy of their fathers and husbands. But along the life-giving waters of the Nile, something extraordinary was happening. Egypt was different. Egypt was revolutionary. Here, in this land of golden sand and emerald waters, women could own property. They could divorce their husbands. They could represent themselves in court, run businesses, command respect. They could even rule. But why? What made Egypt so different from every other civilization of its time? The answer lies not in politics or economics, but in something far more profound. It lies in the very soul of Egyptian belief, in their understanding of the divine feminine, in their recognition that the power to create life was the greatest power of all. Walk with me now through the temples of ancient Thebes. Feel the cool stone beneath your feet, breathe in the incense that still seems to linger in the air. Here, carved into every wall, painted on every ceiling, are the faces of goddesses. Not meek, submissive figures, but powerful, commanding deities who shaped the very fabric of existence. There is Isis, the Great Mother, whose tears flooded the Nile each year. There is Hathor, the goddess of love and music, whose laughter could heal the sick. There is Neith, the weaver of fate, who some believed created the world itself with her shuttle and loom. These were not distant, untouchable figures. These were active, involved goddesses who walked among mortals, who loved and lost, who fought and triumphed. And if goddesses could wield such power, why not mortal women? The most beloved story in all of Egypt tells us everything we need to know about how this civilization viewed women. It is the tale of Osiris and Isis, a story of love, betrayal, death, and resurrection that would echo through the ages. Osiris, the good king, is murdered by his jealous brother Set. His body is dismembered and scattered across Egypt. But it is not another god who saves him. It is not a mighty warrior or a powerful priest. It is his wife, Isis, who travels the length and breadth of the land, gathering the pieces of her beloved's body. It is Isis who uses her magic to bring him back to life. It is Isis who conceives their son Horus, who will grow up to reclaim his father's throne. In this story, the most important story Egypt ever told, the woman is not the victim. She is not the prize to be won or the property to be protected. She is the hero. She is the one with the power to conquer death itself. Is it any wonder, then, that Egyptian women enjoyed freedoms that would not be seen again in the Western world for thousands of years? Consider the legal papyri that have survived from ancient Egypt. Document after document shows us women buying and selling property, entering into business contracts, filing for divorce. When a woman divorced her husband, he was required to return her dowry and pay her a fine. When a man divorced his wife, she owed him nothing. Women could work as scribes, those most revered of professionals who kept the records of the kingdom. They could serve as priestesses, not just of minor deities, but of the great gods themselves. The cult of Isis, the most popular religion in Egypt, was served by both men and women, with women often holding the highest positions. They could even practice medicine. In the tomb of a man named Akhethetep, dating to around 2500 BCE, we find an inscription that mentions his mother, Peshet. Her title? Lady Overseer of the Female Physicians. Not just a physician herself, but the supervisor of other women doctors. This was during the Old Kingdom, when the Great Pyramids were being built, when most of the world still believed that women were incapable of learning to read. But perhaps most remarkably of all, Egyptian women could rule. Not as regents holding power for their young sons, not as temporary placeholders until a male heir came of age, but as pharaohs in their own right, wearing the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, commanding the loyalty of millions. The ancient historian Manetho tells us that Egypt was ruled by women no fewer than 18 times. 18 times. And these are only the ones we know about, the ones whose names survived the systematic attempts to erase them from history. Think about that for a moment. In a world where women were considered property, where they were denied education, where they were forbidden from participating in public life, Egypt was crowning them as living gods. This was not an accident. This was not a series of political emergencies that forced reluctant nobles to accept female rule. This was a civilization that understood something that the rest of the world would not grasp for millennia, that power, true power, has no gender. The Egyptians saw this truth reflected in their gods. They saw it in the annual flood of the Nile, which brought life to their land through the tears of Isis. They saw it in the birth of every child, in the nurturing of every family, in the wisdom of every mother and grandmother. And so they created a society where women could flourish. Where a girl could grow up knowing that her dreams were not limited by her sex. Where she could aspire to be a doctor, a scribe, a priestess, even a pharaoh. But this equality came with a price. It made Egypt's queens targets. It made them threats to the established order of the ancient world. And when Egypt fell, when foreign powers conquered the land of the pharaohs, one of the first things they did was to erase these powerful women from history. They chiseled their names from monuments. They destroyed their statues. They rewrote the king lists to exclude them. They wanted the world to forget that women had ever held such power, that they had ever been considered equal to men. For thousands of years, their plan worked. The queens of Egypt became myths, legends, half-remembered stories told in whispers. But stone is patient. Stone endures. And slowly, carefully, archaeologists and historians have been piecing together the truth. The truth about women who commanded armies and built temples. Women who negotiated with foreign kings and launched trading expeditions to distant lands. Women who wore the sacred urea serpent on their brows and were worshipped as living goddesses. Women who changed the world, and then were erased from it. But they are being erased no longer. Their voices are rising from the sand, their faces emerging from the shadows of history. And their stories will take your breath away. To understand the power of Egypt's queens, we must first understand the divine feminine that permeated every aspect of Egyptian life. This was not a civilization that merely tolerated powerful women, it was a civilization that worshipped them. Step into any Egyptian temple, from the grandest monument at Karnak to the smallest shrine in a village home, and you will find her. The goddess. Not hidden away in some secondary role, not diminished or domesticated, but blazing with power and authority. She is Isis, the throne itself, whose very name means, seat of power. When a pharaoh sat upon his throne, he was literally sitting in the lap of the goddess, drawing his authority from her divine feminine energy. She is the mother of Horus, the protector of the pharaoh, the one who taught humanity the arts of agriculture, medicine, and magic. But Isis is more than just a mother goddess. She is a magician whose power surpasses even that of Ra, the sun god himself. In one famous myth, she tricks Ra into revealing his secret name, the source of his power, by creating a serpent from his own saliva and earth. When the serpent bites him, only Isis has the knowledge to heal him, but first, he must give her his name, and with it, his power. This is not a story about a submissive, nurturing female. This is a story about a woman who outsmarts the king of the gods himself. She is Hathor, the Golden One, goddess of love, music, and joy, but also of fierce protection. When humanity rebels against Ra, it is Hathor who is sent to punish them. She becomes Sekhmet, the lioness, whose rage is so terrible that she nearly destroys all of mankind. Only by tricking her into drinking beer dyed red to look like blood do the gods manage to stop her rampage. She is Neith, the Ancient One, whose cult center at Sais bore the inscription, "I am all that has been, that is, and that will be. No mortal has yet been able to lift the veil that covers me." Some creation myths name her as the first being, the one who spoke the world into existence, the weaver who created the universe on her cosmic loom. She is Mot, the feather of truth, who weighs the hearts of the dead against her feather to determine their fate in the afterlife. Without her approval, even the pharaoh cannot enter the realm of the blessed dead. She is justice personified, the cosmic order that keeps the universe from falling into chaos. These goddesses were not abstract concepts. They were living, breathing presences in the daily lives of the Egyptian people. Women served as their priestesses, channeling their power, speaking their words, performing their rituals. And sometimes these mortal women became so closely identified with their goddesses that the line between human and divine began to blur. Consider the role of the god's wife of Ammonius, the highest religious position a woman could hold in Egypt. This was not merely a ceremonial title. The god's wife was believed to be the earthly consort of Ammonius, the king of the gods. She was his bride, his partner, his equal in the divine realm. The god's wife controlled vast estates, commanded armies of priests and servants, and wielded political influence that rivaled that of the pharaoh himself. She was celibate, married only to the god, free from the earthly bonds that might compromise her divine authority. When Amun-Erdis-I, a Kushite princess, was adopted as god's wife of Ammonius in the 8th century BCE, it was not just a religious appointment. It was a political masterstroke that gave the Kushite rulers of Egypt legitimacy in the eyes of the Egyptian people. By controlling the god's wife, they controlled the most important religious institution in the country. The god's wife lived in a world of ritual and ceremony that we can barely imagine today. She rose each morning to perform the daily rituals that kept the universe in balance. She fed the god, clothed him, sang to him, danced for him. She was his voice on earth, his representative to humanity. And when she died, she was mummified with all the honors of a pharaoh, her body prepared for eternal life in the presence of her divine husband. But the influence of the divine feminine went far beyond formal religious roles. It permeated Egyptian art, literature, and daily life in ways that would have been unthinkable in other ancient civilizations. Egyptian love poetry, some of the most beautiful ever written, often features women as the active pursuers, the ones who initiate romance and express desire. In the Chester Beatty Papyrus, a young woman sings, "I am yours like the field planted with flowers and with all sorts of fragrant plants. Pleasant is the channel through it, which your hand dug out while we cooled ourselves in the north wind." This is not the voice of a passive, submissive woman waiting to be chosen. This is the voice of a woman who knows her own worth, who celebrates her own sexuality, who sees herself as an equal partner in love. Egyptian art consistently shows women participating in all aspects of life. They are shown at banquets, not hidden away but sitting beside their husbands, drinking wine, enjoying music and dance. They are shown in religious ceremonies, not as observers but as active participants, making offerings to the gods, performing rituals, leading processions. They are shown in scenes of daily life, managing estates, overseeing workers, conducting business. The tomb of Nebet, a woman who lived during the 6th dynasty, shows her seated on a throne, receiving tribute from foreign lands. Not as the wife of a powerful man, but as a powerful person in her own right. This artistic evidence is crucial because it shows us not just what Egyptian women could do, but what they actually did. These are not idealized fantasies but documentary records of real women living real lives of power and influence. The divine feminine also manifested in the Egyptian understanding of creation itself. While many ancient cultures saw creation as a violent act, a battle between male gods, Egyptian creation myths often emphasized the feminine principles of birth, nurturing, and growth. In one version of the creation story, the god Adam creates the first divine couple, Shu and Tefnut, by masturbating. But in another version, it is the goddess Neith who weaves the world into existence on her loom, creating the universe through the feminine arts of spinning and weaving. The annual flood of the Nile, the most important event in the Egyptian calendar, was understood as the tears of Isis mourning for her dead husband Osiris. The life-giving waters that made Egypt fertile and prosperous came from a woman's grief, a woman's love, a woman's power to transform death into life. This understanding of the divine feminine created a cultural context in which mortal women could wield extraordinary power. If goddesses could rule the universe, if they could create life and death, if they could command the loyalty of gods and mortals alike, then surely mortal women, especially those chosen by the gods, could rule earthly kingdoms. And so they did. One by one, across the long centuries of Egyptian history, women stepped forward to claim the throne of the pharaohs. They wore the false beard of kingship, they carried the crook and flail of royal authority, they built temples and monuments that still inspire awe today. They ruled not in spite of their femininity, but because of it. They ruled because Egypt understood what the rest of the ancient world did not, that the power to create life is the greatest power of all, and that power belongs to women. In the beginning, there was Nefertiti. Her name whispers to us across 5,000 years, carved in hieroglyphs on a tomb so grand that archaeologists first mistook it for that of a king. Nefertiti, whose name means, Neth is satisfied, wife of Narmer, the first pharaoh to unite Upper and Lower Egypt into a single kingdom. But was she merely a wife? Or was she something more? The evidence suggests something extraordinary. Her tomb at Nakada is massive, filled with grave goods fit for a ruler. Her name appears on a serek, that sacred symbol reserved for royalty, the clay representation of the royal palace that proclaimed to all the world, here lies a king. Or in this case, a queen. We may never know for certain whether Nefertiti ruled Egypt in her own right, perhaps as regent after Narmer's death, perhaps as co-ruler during his lifetime. The records from this earliest period of Egyptian history are fragmentary, incomplete, tantalizing in their hints and suggestions. But her tomb tells a story that words cannot. It tells us that here was a woman of such importance, such power, that she was buried with all the honors of a pharaoh. It tells us that from the very beginning of Egyptian civilization, women were not just wives and mothers, but potential rulers, potential gods. The pattern continues with Mernith, whose name means, beloved of Neith. She lived around 2990 BCE, during the First Dynasty, wife of King Jet and mother of King Denver. When Jet died and Den was still too young to rule, Mernith stepped forward to serve as regent. But the evidence suggests she was more than just a placeholder. Like Nefertiti, her name appears on a serek. Her tomb at Abydos is surrounded by the subsidiary burials of servants and officials, a practice reserved for kings. Most tellingly, her name appears on contemporary seal impressions alongside those of the pharaohs, suggesting that she was recognized as a legitimate ruler in her own right. Imagine her, this woman of nearly 5,000 years ago, standing in the great hall of the palace at Memphis, the double crown of Egypt upon her head, the crook and flail of pharaonic authority in her hands. Around her, the nobles of Egypt kneel in submission, acknowledging her as their sovereign, their living god. What must it have felt like to be the first? To break a barrier that had never been broken before? To prove that a woman could command armies, govern provinces, maintain the cosmic order that kept Egypt prosperous and secure? The records are silent on such personal details. But the monuments speak. They tell us that Mernitha's reign was successful, that Egypt prospered under her rule, that when her son came of age, he inherited a kingdom that was stronger and more unified than ever before. Centuries pass. The Old Kingdom rises, that golden age when the Great Pyramids were built, when Egyptian power and culture reached heights that would never be surpassed. And here we meet another remarkable woman, Hatshepsut. She was the wife of Sneferu, the pharaoh who built the first true pyramid, and the mother of Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid of Giza. But Hatshepsut was far more than just a royal wife and mother. She was a power broker, a political force who may have been the key to her husband's rise to the throne. Some scholars believe that Hatshepsut was the daughter of Huni, the last king of the Third Dynasty. If so, then her marriage to Sneferu was not just a love match but a political alliance that legitimized his claim to the throne and ensured a smooth transition between dynasties. The evidence for her importance lies in her tomb, discovered in 1925 near the Great Pyramid. It was filled with treasures of unimaginable beauty and value, golden furniture, jewelry fit for a goddess, canopic jars that once held her mummified organs. But most significantly, it was built by her son Khufu, the most powerful pharaoh of the Old Kingdom, who chose to honor his mother by placing her tomb near his own pyramid complex. This was not the gesture of a dutiful son honoring a beloved but powerless mother. This was the acknowledgement of a debt, the recognition that Hatshepsut had been instrumental in the family's rise to power. But perhaps the most intriguing of these early queens is also the most controversial, Nitocris, whose very existence has been debated by scholars for over a century. Her name appears in the ancient king lists compiled by Manetho, the Egyptian priest who wrote a history of Egypt for the Greek rulers of the Ptolemaic period. She is mentioned by Eratosthenes, the great Greek scholar. She appears in the Turin king list and the Abydos king list, those sacred records of pharaonic succession. But she left no monuments, no inscriptions, no contemporary records. For years, scholars dismissed her as a myth, a mistake, a misreading of ancient texts. Until recently. Now, many Egyptologists believe that Nitocris was real, that she was indeed the first woman to rule Egypt as pharaoh in her own right, not as regent or co-ruler, but as sole sovereign of the two lands. The story of her rise to power, as told by the Greek historian Herodotus, reads like something from a thriller novel. According to Herodotus, Nitocris came to power after her brother, the previous pharaoh, was murdered by his nobles. The conspirators, thinking they could control her, placed her on the throne. They were wrong. Nitocris, according to the story, invited the conspirators to a great feast in an underground chamber. As they dined and drank, celebrating their success, she opened hidden channels that flooded the chamber with water from the Nile. The men who had murdered her brother drowned in the very room where they thought they were celebrating their victory. And then, having avenged her brother's death, Nitocris threw herself into a chamber filled with hot ashes, choosing death over the revenge that would surely follow. Is the story true? We may never know. Herodotus was writing centuries after the events he described, and he was known to embellish his tales for dramatic effect. But true or not, the story tells us something important about how the ancient world viewed Egyptian queens, as women capable of both great love and terrible vengeance, as rulers who would stop at nothing to protect their power and their people. These early queens, Nefertiti, Mernith, Hetepheres, Nitocris, were pioneers. They broke barriers that had never been broken before. They proved that women could rule, that they could command respect and loyalty, that they could maintain the cosmic order that kept Egypt prosperous and secure. They were not perfect. They made mistakes, faced challenges, sometimes failed. But they persevered. They carved out spaces for women in the highest echelons of power. They created precedents that would be followed by the great queens who came after them. And most importantly, they survived. Despite attempts to erase them from history, despite the passage of millennia, despite the rise and fall of empires, their names have come down to us. Their stories have endured. They remind us that the desire for power, for recognition, for the chance to shape the world, is not a modern phenomenon. It is as old as humanity itself. And in ancient Egypt, for a brief, shining moment in history, that desire was not limited by gender. Women could dream of ruling the world, and sometimes, those dreams came true. But these early queens were just the beginning. The greatest of Egypt's female rulers were yet to come. Women who would not just break barriers but shatter them completely. Women who would rule for decades, build monuments that still inspire awe, and leave legacies that would echo through the ages. Women like Hatshepsut, who would wear the false beard of kingship for 22 years and transform Egypt into the greatest power in the ancient world. Women like Nefertiti, whose beauty would become legendary but whose political acumen would reshape Egyptian religion and culture. Women like Cleopatra, who would be the last pharaoh of Egypt and whose death would mark the end of 3,000 years of pharaonic rule. Their stories are coming. Stories of love and betrayal, of triumph and tragedy, of power gained and power lost. Stories that will take us from the heights of royal palaces to the depths of hidden tombs, from the glory of military victory to the agony of political defeat. Stories that will show us what it truly meant to be a queen in ancient Egypt, and what it cost. The year is 2500 BCE. The Great Pyramids of Giza are rising from the desert sands, monuments to the divine power of the pharaohs. In the shadow of these eternal tombs, in the bustling streets of Memphis, a woman named Peshet is making history. She is not a queen. She wears no crown, carries no royal scepter. But in her hands, she holds something perhaps even more powerful, the knowledge to heal, the wisdom to save lives, the authority to command other physicians. Peshet is the world's first known female doctor. Her title, carved in hieroglyphs on her son's tomb, reads, Lady Overseer of the Female Physicians. Not just a physician herself, but the supervisor, the leader, the one in charge of other women doctors. This single inscription revolutionizes our understanding of women's roles in ancient Egypt. Imagine her world. To become a physician in ancient Egypt, one first had to master the art of writing. Peshet would have spent years as a student scribe, learning the complex hieroglyphic system, memorizing the sacred texts, studying at the Per Ankh, the House of Life, where all medical knowledge was preserved. Picture her bent over papyrus scrolls by lamplight, copying medical treatises that described surgical procedures, pharmaceutical recipes, diagnostic techniques. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, the Ebers Papyrus, the Kahan Gynecological Papyrus, these were her textbooks, her guides to the mysteries of the human body. Egyptian medicine was remarkably advanced for its time. Egyptian physicians could perform surgery, set broken bones, treat infections, even perform what may have been the world's first documented brain surgery. They understood that the heart was the center of the circulatory system, that the pulse could indicate health or disease, that cleanliness was essential to healing. And women like Peshet were at the forefront of this medical revolution. But why were women allowed to practice medicine in Egypt when they were excluded from the profession in virtually every other ancient civilization? The answer, once again, lies in Egyptian religious beliefs. The goddess Isis was not just a mother and wife, she was also the great healer, the one who had brought Osiris back from the dead. Her knowledge of magic and medicine was legendary. She was the patroness of physicians, the divine source of all healing knowledge. If the greatest healer in the Egyptian pantheon was female, then it made perfect sense for mortal women to follow in her footsteps. Peshet would have invoked Isis in her daily practice. Before examining a patient, she might have recited, "I am Isis, the great magician, the one who knows the secret names of all things. Through me, the power of healing flows." Her patients would have trusted her not just because of her medical knowledge, but because they believed she was channeling the power of the goddess herself. What was it like to be a female physician in ancient Egypt? The evidence suggests that women doctors often specialized in gynecology and obstetrics, natural areas of expertise given their own experiences with childbirth and women's health issues. The Kahan Gynecological Papyrus, dating to around 1800 BCE, contains treatments for a wide range of women's health problems, fertility issues, pregnancy complications, menstrual disorders. Some of the treatments seem remarkably modern, the use of honey as an antiseptic, for example, or the recommendation of certain herbs that we now know have genuine medicinal properties. But women physicians were not limited to treating only women. Peshet's title suggests that she oversaw a whole department of female physicians, implying that women doctors were common enough to require supervision and organization. The tomb inscription that mentions Peshet also gives her another title, King's Associate. This suggests that she may have served as a physician to the royal family, perhaps even to the pharaoh himself. Imagine the trust and respect this would have required, a woman, in an age when women were considered inferior in most of the world, being entrusted with the health of the living god of Egypt. But Peshet was not the only woman breaking barriers in the intellectual world of ancient Egypt. Women also served as scribes, those most revered of professionals who kept the records of the kingdom. The goddess Peshet, she who scrivens, was the divine patroness of scribes and libraries. She was depicted as a woman wearing a leopard skin dress, with a 7-pointed star above her head and a palm leaf in her hand for measuring and recording. She was the keeper of the royal annals, the recorder of the pharaoh's deeds, the one who wrote the names of kings on the leaves of the sacred Persea tree. Under her divine protection, mortal women could aspire to join the ranks of the scribes. They could learn to read and write, to keep accounts, to compose letters and legal documents. They could work in the temples, recording offerings and maintaining religious texts. They could serve in the royal administration, helping to govern the vast bureaucracy that kept Egypt functioning. The evidence for female scribes comes from many sources. Tomb paintings show women holding scribal palettes and reed pens. Papyri contain references to female scribes working in various capacities. Most remarkably, we have the actual writings of some of these women, letters, accounts, even literary works that show us the voices of educated Egyptian women across the centuries. One such woman was Iartrau, who lived during the 26th dynasty. Her title was simply scribe, with no qualifying adjectives to indicate that her gender made her role unusual or limited. She was, quite simply, a professional scribe, equal in status to her male colleagues. These women, physicians like Peshet, scribes like Iartrau, were part of a professional class that existed nowhere else in the ancient world. They were educated, independent, respected for their knowledge and skills. They earned their own income, controlled their own property, made their own decisions about their lives and careers. They were living proof that Egyptian society's commitment to gender equality was not just theoretical but practical, not just religious but economic and social. But perhaps most importantly, they were creating a foundation for the even more remarkable women who would follow them. By proving that women could master complex knowledge, could be trusted with important responsibilities, could command respect and authority, they were paving the way for women to claim the ultimate prize, the throne of Egypt itself. The path from Peshet's medical practice to Hatshepsut's royal palace was not a straight one. It was built by countless women, most of whose names we will never know, who pushed boundaries, challenged assumptions, and refused to accept that their gender should limit their ambitions. They were the teachers who educated the next generation of women. They were the role models who showed young girls what was possible. They were the pioneers who proved that intelligence, competence, and leadership were not the exclusive province of men. And in the temples of Egypt, in the most sacred spaces of the kingdom, other women were claiming even greater power. They were becoming the brides of gods, the voices of the divine, the earthly representatives of the most powerful deities in the Egyptian pantheon. They were the gods' wives of Ammonius, and their story is one of the most remarkable in all of ancient history. In the heart of Thebes, in the shadow of the great temple of Karnak, there lived a woman who was married to a god. She was not a myth, not a legend, not a figure from some ancient fairy tale. She was real, flesh and blood, a mortal woman who held one of the most powerful positions in all of Egypt. She was the god's wife of Ammonius, and her authority rivaled that of the pharaoh himself. To understand the extraordinary power of these women, we must first understand Ammonius, the god they served. Ammonius, whose name means the Hidden One, was the king of the Egyptian gods, the supreme deity who ruled over all others. He was the creator god, the one who spoke the world into existence, the source of all life and power. But Ammonius was not a distant, untouchable deity. He was believed to be physically present in his temple, dwelling within the sacred statue that was housed in the innermost sanctuary of Karnak. And like any king, he needed a queen. Enter the god's wife of Ammonius. This was not a ceremonial position. The god's wife was believed to be the actual consort of the god, his earthly bride, his partner in the divine realm. She was celibate, married only to Ammonius, free from earthly attachments that might compromise her divine authority. But what did this mean in practical terms? What kind of power did the god's wife actually wield? The answer is staggering. The god's wife of Ammonius controlled vast estates throughout Egypt. She commanded armies of priests, servants, and administrators. She owned fleets of ships, herds of cattle, fields of grain. She was, in effect, the CEO of one of the largest and wealthiest organizations in the ancient world. Every morning, she would perform the daily rituals that kept the universe in balance. She would enter the sacred sanctuary, approach the golden statue of Ammonius, and wake the god with songs and prayers. She would bathe him, dress him in fresh linen, anoint him with precious oils, offer him food and drink. These were not empty gestures. The Egyptians believed that if these rituals were not performed correctly, if the god was not properly cared for, the cosmic order would collapse. The Nile would not flood, the sun would not rise, chaos would consume the world. The god's wife held the fate of Egypt in her hands. But her power extended far beyond religious ritual. She was a major political player, a kingmaker whose support could legitimize a pharaoh's rule or whose opposition could threaten his throne. Consider the case of Amun I, a Kushite princess who became God's wife of Ammonius in the 8th century BCE. The Kushites, rulers of the kingdom of Nubia to the south of Egypt, had conquered Egypt and established themselves as the 25th dynasty. But they faced a problem: how could foreign rulers convince the Egyptian people to accept their legitimacy? The answer was Amun I. By adopting her as God's wife of Ammonius, the Kushite rulers gained control of the most important religious institution in Egypt. Amun became their representative in Thebes, their voice in the religious capital of the kingdom. Through her, they could claim divine approval for their rule. The adoption ceremony was a masterpiece of political theater. Amun was brought from Nubia to Thebes in a great procession, accompanied by tribute-bearers carrying gold, ivory, and exotic animals. She was formally adopted by the previous god's wife, Hatshepsut I, in a ceremony that was recorded on the walls of the temple. The inscription reads, "The god's wife, the divine adoratress, Hatshepsut, justified, she made as her daughter the daughter of the king of Upper and Lower Egypt, Kashta, justified, the god's wife, the divine adoratress, Amun justified, to be God's wife after her." With these words, a Kushite princess became one of the most powerful women in Egypt. She would hold the position for over 60 years, outlasting multiple pharaohs, becoming a symbol of stability and continuity in a time of political upheaval. But Amun was not content to be merely a religious figurehead. She used her position to promote Kushite culture and values throughout Egypt. She commissioned statues and reliefs that depicted her in traditional Kushite dress, with the distinctive hairstyles and jewelry of her homeland. She patronized artists and craftsmen who created works that blended Egyptian and Kushite artistic traditions. Most remarkably, she established a system of succession that ensured the god's wife position would remain in Kushite hands for generations. She adopted Hatshepsut II, another Kushite princess, as her successor, creating a dynasty of gods' wives that would last for over a century. The power of the gods' wives was not just political and economic, it was also deeply personal and spiritual. These women were believed to have a direct, intimate relationship with the god. They were his beloved, his confidant, his partner in the cosmic dance that kept the universe in motion. The walls of their tombs and temples are covered with scenes of their divine marriage. We see them standing before Amun, receiving his blessing, sharing in his power. We see them performing the sacred rituals that only they could perform, speaking the secret words that only they knew. In one remarkable relief from the temple of Medinet Habu, we see the god's wife Amun standing before Amun in a pose of intimate familiarity. She is not kneeling in submission but standing as an equal, her hand raised in blessing, her face serene with divine authority. The inscription beside the scene reads, "The god's wife, the divine adoratress, the hand of the god, Amun, beloved of Amun Ra, king of the gods, given life like Ra forever." These titles, God's wife, divine adoratress, hand of the god, were not just honorifics. They described real roles, real responsibilities, real power. The god's wife was the god's beloved, the divine adoratress was the one who worshipped him, the hand of the god was the one who acted on his behalf in the mortal world. Together, these titles made the god's wife one of the most powerful people in Egypt, male or female. She was the voice of the god, the interpreter of his will, the executor of his commands. But this power came with a price. The god's wife was required to remain celibate, to have no earthly husband, no children of her own. She was married to the god alone, and that marriage demanded total devotion. This requirement of celibacy was not just a religious obligation, it was also a political necessity. If the god's wife had children, those children might claim divine authority through their mother. They might challenge the pharaoh's supremacy, create rival dynasties, threaten the stability of the kingdom. By remaining celibate, the god's wife ensured that her power would not become hereditary, that it would not create competing claims to divine authority. She was a bridge between the human and divine realms, but she was not a founder of dynasties. Instead, she would adopt a successor, usually a young girl from a politically important family. This adoption was not just a transfer of title, it was a mystical transformation. The adopted daughter would undergo years of training, learning the secret rituals, memorizing the sacred texts, preparing to become the bride of the god. When the old god's wife died, the new one would step seamlessly into her role, maintaining the continuity of divine marriage that was so crucial to Egyptian religious belief. The last great god's wife of Amun was Nefertiti, daughter of the pharaoh Samtik I. She was adopted by Hatshepsut II in 656 BCE, in a ceremony that marked the end of Kushite rule and the beginning of the Sate dynasty. Nefertari would hold the position for over 60 years, becoming one of the most powerful and influential women in Egyptian history. She oversaw the restoration of temples damaged during the Assyrian invasions, patronized artists and scholars, and maintained the religious traditions that had sustained Egypt for millennia. When she died, she was buried with all the honors of a pharaoh, her tomb filled with treasures fit for a goddess. But more importantly, she was remembered as a woman who had bridged the gap between the human and divine realms, who had served as the earthly representative of the king of the gods. The gods' wives of Amun were more than just religious figures. They were political power brokers, economic leaders, cultural patrons, and spiritual guides. They proved that women could wield the highest forms of authority, that they could command respect and loyalty, that they could serve as intermediaries between the mortal and divine realms. They were the predecessors of the great female pharaohs, the women who would take the final step from divine consort to divine ruler. They showed that a woman could be trusted with ultimate power, that she could maintain the cosmic order, that she could serve as the living representative of the gods on earth. And the greatest of these female pharaohs was about to take the stage. A woman who would rule Egypt for 22 years, who would build monuments that still inspire awe today, who would transform herself from queen to king and back again. Her name was Hatshepsut, and her story is one of the most remarkable in all of human history. She stands before us in stone, eternal and enigmatic, her face serene beneath the false beard of kingship. The ureus serpent coils upon her brow, the double crown of Egypt rests upon her head, the crook and flail of pharaonic authority cross her chest. This is Hatshepsut, and she is a contradiction made manifest. She is a woman who became a man, a queen who became a king, a regent who became a pharaoh. She ruled Egypt for 22 years, longer than almost any other pharaoh in Egyptian history, and she did it all while wearing the sacred beard that proclaimed her divine masculinity. But how did a woman come to wear the false beard of the pharaohs? How did she convince a kingdom that had been ruled by men for over 1,000 years to accept her as their living god? The answer lies in a combination of political brilliance, religious innovation, and sheer force of will that makes Hatshepsut one of the most remarkable rulers in human history. Her story begins in the royal palace at Thebes, where she was born around 1507 BCE, the daughter of Thutmose I and his principal wife, Ahmose. From birth, she was destined for greatness, but not the kind of greatness she would ultimately achieve. As a royal daughter, Hatshepsut was expected to marry her half-brother, Thutmose II, and serve as his queen. This was the traditional path for royal women, to legitimize their husband's rule through their own royal bloodline, to bear sons who would inherit the throne, to support and advise but never to rule. Hatshepsut had other plans. When Thutmose II died after a brief reign, he left behind a young son, Thutmose III, born to a minor wife named Isis. According to tradition, Hatshepsut should have served as regent for the boy king until he came of age. She should have guided him, advised him, and then stepped aside to let him rule. Instead, she did something unprecedented. She declared herself pharaoh. But how could a woman claim the throne of Egypt? How could she convince the nobles, the priests, the people that she had the right to rule? Hatshepsut's answer was brilliant in its audacity. She claimed that she had been chosen by the gods themselves, that her rule was not a usurpation but a divine mandate. On the walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, she commissioned a series of reliefs that told the story of her divine birth. According to these scenes, the god Ammonius himself had chosen her mother, Queen Ahmose, to bear his divine child. Ammonius had appeared to Ahmose in the form of Thutmose I, had made love to her, and had conceived Hatshepsut as his own daughter. The reliefs show Ammonius declaring, "Hatshepsut shall be the name of this my daughter whom I have placed in thy body. She shall exercise the excellent kingship in this whole land." This was not just propaganda, it was a theological revolution. Hatshepsut was claiming that she was not just a pharaoh but a god, not just a ruler but the direct offspring of the king of the gods himself. But divine birth alone was not enough. Hatshepsut also had to transform herself physically and symbolically from woman to man, from queen to king. She began to appear in reliefs and statues wearing the false beard of kingship, that sacred symbol of pharaonic authority that had been worn by every pharaoh since the beginning of Egyptian history. She adopted masculine titles, calling herself King of Upper and Lower Egypt rather than Queen. She wore the traditional pharaonic regalia, the double crown, the ureus serpent, the crook and flail. Most remarkably, she began to be depicted with a male body. Early in her reign, statues show her with feminine features and a female form. But as her rule progressed, her artistic representations became increasingly masculine. Her breasts disappeared, her hips narrowed, her shoulders broadened. She was literally transforming herself from woman to man before the eyes of her people. This transformation was not just cosmetic, it was deeply religious. In Egyptian belief, the pharaoh was the earthly incarnation of the god Horus, and Horus was male. For a woman to rule as pharaoh, she had to become, in some mystical sense, a man. Hatshepsut understood this, and she embraced it completely. She did not try to rule as a woman, she ruled as a man who happened to have been born in a woman's body. But transformation alone was not enough to secure her throne. Hatshepsut also had to prove that she could rule effectively, that Egypt would prosper under her leadership. And prosper it did. Hatshepsut's reign was one of the most peaceful and prosperous in Egyptian history. She launched no major military campaigns, fought no great wars, conquered no new territories. Instead, she focused on trade, diplomacy, and internal development. Her greatest achievement was the expedition to Punt, a mysterious land somewhere along the coast of East Africa. This was not a military conquest but a trading mission, designed to bring back the exotic goods that Egypt craved: gold, ivory, ebony, incense, and most precious of all, myrrh trees. The walls of her temple at Deir el-Bahari are covered with scenes from this expedition. We see Egyptian ships sailing down the Red Sea, their holds filled with trade goods. We see the Queen of Punt greeting the Egyptian envoys, her body grotesquely obese in the Egyptian artistic style used to depict foreigners. We see the Egyptians loading their ships with treasures, including live myrrh trees that would be transplanted to Egyptian soil. The inscription reads, "The loading of the ships very heavily with marvels of the country of Punt, all goodly fragrant woods of God's land, heaps of myrrh resin, with fresh myrrh trees, with ebony and pure ivory, with green gold of emu, with cinnamon wood, kesut wood, with 2 kinds of incense, cosmetic, with apes, monkeys, dogs, and with skins of the southern panther, with natives and their children." This was diplomacy through trade, power through prosperity. Hatshepsut was showing that Egypt could achieve greatness not through conquest but through commerce, not through war but through wealth. But her greatest monument was not a military victory or a trading expedition, it was a building. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari is one of the most beautiful and innovative structures ever built in ancient Egypt. Rising from the desert floor in a series of terraced colonnades, the temple seems to grow organically from the cliffs behind it. It is a masterpiece of architectural harmony, a perfect fusion of human artistry and natural beauty. The temple was not just a monument to Hatshepsut's ego, it was a theological statement. By building her temple in the shadow of the peak that the Egyptians called the Horn, which was sacred to the goddess Hathor, Hatshepsut was associating herself with the divine feminine even as she ruled as a man. The temple's walls tell the story of her reign in exquisite detail. We see her divine birth, her coronation, her trading expeditions, her religious ceremonies. We see her offering to the gods, receiving their blessings, performing the rituals that maintain the cosmic order. But perhaps most remarkably, we see her with her stepson, Thutmose III, the young man who should have been her rival but who instead became her co-ruler. Far from eliminating him as a threat, Hatshepsut included him in her government, trained him in the arts of kingship, prepared him to rule after her. This was perhaps her greatest political achievement. By sharing power with Thutmose III, by treating him as a partner rather than a rival, she ensured the stability of her reign and the smooth transition of power after her death. For 22 years, Hatshepsut ruled Egypt with wisdom, prosperity, and peace. She built temples, sponsored trade expeditions, maintained diplomatic relations with foreign powers. She proved that a woman could rule as effectively as any man, that gender was no barrier to effective leadership. And then, around 1458 BCE, she disappeared from history. We do not know how Hatshepsut died. We do not know if she died of natural causes, was murdered, or simply stepped aside to let Thutmose III rule alone. Her mummy has never been definitively identified, though some scholars believe it may have been found in a modest tomb in the Valley of the Kings. What we do know is that after her death, a systematic campaign began to erase her from history. Her name was chiseled from monuments, her statues were destroyed or defaced, her reliefs were covered with plaster and painted over. For centuries, scholars believed that this erasure was the work of Thutmose III, seeking revenge against the stepmother who had usurped his throne. But recent research suggests a different explanation. The erasure may have been a religious necessity, an attempt to restore the proper cosmic order by eliminating the memory of a woman who had ruled as a man. Or perhaps it was simply politics. Later pharaohs may have feared that Hatshepsut's example would inspire other women to claim the throne, threatening the male monopoly on power that had been restored after her death. Whatever the reason, the erasure was not complete. Enough evidence survived for modern archaeologists and historians to piece together her story, to restore her to her rightful place in history. Today, Hatshepsut is recognized as one of the greatest pharaohs in Egyptian history, male or female. She ruled longer than most, achieved more than many, and left behind monuments that still inspire awe and wonder. But perhaps her greatest achievement was simply proving that it could be done. That a woman could rule Egypt, could wear the false beard of kingship, could command the loyalty of millions and the respect of the gods themselves. She opened a door that could never be completely closed. She created a precedent that would inspire the great queens who came after her. She showed that power, true power, has no gender. And in the tombs and temples of Egypt, in the whispered stories passed down through generations, in the dreams of every girl who ever dared to imagine herself wearing a crown, Hatshepsut lives on. The pharaoh who wore the beard, the woman who became a king, the queen who changed the world forever. In the Valley of the Queens, beneath the golden cliffs of western Thebes, lies a tomb that is more than a tomb. It is a love letter written in stone, a poem carved in eternal hieroglyphs, a testament to a love so profound that it has survived for over 3,000 years. This is the tomb of Nefertari, the beloved wife of Ramesses II, the woman who was called, the one for whom the sun shines. But Nefertari was more than just a beloved wife. She was a queen in the truest sense of the word, a woman who wielded real political power, who corresponded with foreign rulers, who served as her husband's partner in governing the greatest empire the ancient world had ever known. Her story is one of love and politics, of romance and statecraft, of a woman who managed to be both the object of passionate devotion and a shrewd political operator in her own right. Ramesses II, known to history as Ramesses the Great, ruled Egypt for 66 years, from 1279 to 1213 BCE. He was one of the most powerful pharaohs in Egyptian history, a military genius who expanded Egypt's borders, a builder who covered the land with monuments to his own glory. But for all his power, for all his achievements, Ramesses II is perhaps best remembered for one thing: his love for Nefertari. Her name means beautiful companion, and from the moment she appears in the historical record, it is clear that she was far more than just another royal wife. Ramesses had many wives, the records speak of at least 8 principal wives and dozens of minor ones. But Nefertari was different. She was his great royal wife, his partner, his equal. The evidence of their relationship is written across the monuments of Egypt. At Abu Simbel, Ramesses built 2 temples carved into the living rock. The larger temple is dedicated to himself and the gods, a monument to royal power and divine authority. But the smaller temple is dedicated to Nefertari and the goddess Hathor, and it bears an inscription that reveals the depth of Ramesses' feelings for his queen. A temple made by Ramesses II for the great royal wife Nefertari Meretmut, for whose sake the very sun does shine. Think about that for a moment. This is a pharaoh, a man who was worshipped as a living god, declaring that the sun itself shines for his wife. This is not the language of political alliance or dynastic necessity. This is the language of love. But the most extraordinary testament to their relationship lies in Nefertari's tomb in the Valley of the Queens. Designated QV66 by archaeologists, it is one of the largest and most beautifully decorated tombs in all of Egypt. Every surface is covered with exquisite paintings that tell the story of Nefertari's journey through the afterlife. We see her playing Senet, the ancient Egyptian board game, with invisible opponents. We see her making offerings to the gods, receiving their blessings, being welcomed into the realm of the blessed dead. But most remarkably, we see her with Ramesses himself, not just in this life but in the next. The tomb paintings show them together in eternity, their love transcending even death. The hieroglyphic texts that accompany these scenes are some of the most beautiful love poetry ever written. One inscription reads, "My love is unique, no one can rival her, for she is the most beautiful woman alive. Just by passing, she has stolen away my heart." Another declares, "The one for whom the sun shines, the sweet of love, the lady of grace, rich in charm, sweet of love in the arms of the king." These are not the formal, stilted phrases typical of royal inscriptions. These are the words of a man deeply, passionately in love with his wife. But Nefertari was not just the object of Ramesses' affection, she was also his political partner. The evidence shows that she played an active role in governing Egypt, that she corresponded with foreign rulers, that she participated in diplomatic negotiations. One of the most remarkable documents to survive from ancient Egypt is a letter from Nefertari to Pujahipa, the queen of the Hittites. The Hittites were Egypt's great rivals, the other superpower of the ancient Near East. For decades, Egypt and the Hittites had fought for control of Syria and Palestine. But in 1259 BCE, Ramesses and the Hittite king Hattusili III signed a peace treaty, the first recorded peace treaty in human history. And Nefertari played a crucial role in the negotiations. Her letter to Queen Pujahipa, written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the time, reveals a sophisticated understanding of international politics. Thus speaks Naptera, the great queen of Egypt, to Pujahipa, the great queen of Hutti, "My sister, I am well, and you, my sister, may you be well. Behold, I have learned that you, my sister, have written to me asking after my well-being, and that you have written to me because of the good relations and the peace which the son, the great king, the king of Egypt, has made with my brother, the great king, the king of Hutti. This is not the letter of a decorative queen confined to the women's quarters. This is the correspondence of a woman who understood the complexities of international diplomacy, who could negotiate with foreign powers, who was trusted by her husband to represent Egypt's interests abroad. The letter continues with discussions of trade agreements, diplomatic protocols, and mutual defense arrangements. Nefertari was not just writing pleasantries, she was conducting serious international business. But perhaps the most revealing aspect of the letter is its tone. Nefertari addresses Pujahipa as my sister, using the language of equality and mutual respect. She is not writing as a subordinate to a superior, or even as one queen to another. She is writing as one head of state to another. This suggests that Nefertari's role in Egyptian government was far more significant than we might expect. She was not just Ramesses' wife, she was his partner in ruling Egypt. The evidence for her political influence can be seen throughout Ramesses' reign. She appears in official ceremonies, participates in religious rituals, is depicted receiving tribute from foreign lands. In one relief from the temple of Abu Simbel, she is shown standing beside Ramesses as he receives the submission of Nubian chiefs. She is not in the background, not relegated to a secondary position. She is right there beside him, an equal participant in the ceremony. This equality extended to their religious roles as well. In Egyptian belief, the pharaoh was the earthly representative of the god Horus, while the queen was associated with various goddesses, particularly Hathor and Isis. But Nefertari's religious role seems to have been unusually prominent. She is depicted performing religious ceremonies that were typically reserved for the pharaoh himself. She makes offerings to the gods, participates in temple rituals, even appears to conduct religious ceremonies on her own authority. In one remarkable scene from her tomb, she is shown playing senet with the god Thoth, the deity of wisdom and writing. This is not just a game. Senet was believed to be a metaphor for the journey through the afterlife, and the fact that Nefertari is shown playing it with a god suggests that she was considered to have special divine favor. But for all her political and religious importance, Nefertari is perhaps best remembered for the love story that she shared with Ramesses. Their relationship seems to have been genuinely affectionate, based on mutual respect and genuine attraction. The evidence for this can be seen not just in the formal inscriptions and official monuments, but in the small, personal details that have survived. In Nefertari's tomb, for example, there is a scene showing her cosmetic box, decorated with images of ducks and lotus flowers. This is not a grand political statement, it is a glimpse into the private life of a woman who cared about her appearance, who took pleasure in beautiful things. Another scene shows her jewelry box, filled with earrings, bracelets, and necklaces. Again, this is not about politics or power, it is about a woman who enjoyed luxury, who took pride in her appearance, who was, in many ways, just like women throughout history. But perhaps the most touching evidence of their relationship comes from the inscriptions that Ramesses had carved after Nefertari's death. These are not the formal, ritualistic phrases typical of royal monuments. They are the words of a man grieving for the woman he loved. My beloved, my heart's desire, the one who was more beautiful than all others, she has gone to the place of eternity, and my heart weeps for her. Nefertari died sometime around 1255 BCE, probably in her 40s. The cause of her death is unknown, but it seems to have been sudden and unexpected. Ramesses was devastated. He ordered that she be buried with all the honors of a pharaoh, in the most beautiful tomb that had ever been created for a queen. He commissioned the finest artists in Egypt to decorate her tomb, sparing no expense to ensure that her journey to the afterlife would be as magnificent as her life had been. But more than that, he seems to have genuinely mourned her loss. After her death, none of his other wives achieved the prominence that Nefertari had enjoyed. None of them were given the title, Great Royal Wife. None of them were depicted as his equal in the way that Nefertari had been. It was as if, with Nefertari's death, something had gone out of Ramesses' life. He continued to rule for another 40 years, continued to build monuments and fight wars and govern his empire. But the great love story of his life was over. Today, visitors to Nefertari's tomb can still see the evidence of that love story. The paintings on the walls are as vivid as the day they were created, the colors as bright, the images as moving. The tomb has been carefully restored, and visitors can walk through the same chambers where Nefertari's mummy once lay, surrounded by the treasures that would accompany her to the afterlife. But the tomb is more than just a tourist attraction. It is a testament to the power of love, to the possibility of true partnership between a man and a woman, even in an age when women were often treated as property. Nefertari and Ramesses showed that a royal marriage could be more than just a political alliance. It could be a genuine partnership, based on love, respect, and mutual admiration. They showed that a queen could be more than just a decorative figure, she could be a real political force, a partner in governing an empire. And they showed that love, true love, can transcend even death. In the paintings on Nefertari's tomb walls, she and Ramesses are together for eternity, their love story continuing in the realm of the gods. It is a beautiful story, a romantic story, a story that reminds us that even in the ancient world, even among the most powerful people on earth, love could flourish. But Nefertari's story is also a reminder of the precarious position of women in the ancient world. For all her power, for all her influence, for all the love that Ramesses bore her, she was still dependent on his favor. When she died, her power died with her. She left no dynasty, no lasting political legacy, no institutional changes that would benefit other women. She was, in the end, a remarkable individual who achieved extraordinary things within the constraints of her time and place. But she could not change those constraints. She could not create a world where women routinely held the kind of power that she had enjoyed. That would be left to other queens, other women who would push the boundaries even further, who would challenge not just individual prejudices but the entire structure of ancient society. Women like Nefertiti, whose beauty would become legendary but whose political acumen would reshape Egyptian religion and culture. Women like Cleopatra, who would be the last pharaoh of Egypt and whose death would mark the end of 3,000 years of pharaonic rule. Their stories are coming. Stories of ambition and achievement, of triumph and tragedy, of women who dared to reach for the ultimate prize, the throne of Egypt itself. Her face is the most famous in the ancient world. Elegant, serene, eternally beautiful, it gazes out at us from museums and textbooks, from postcards and posters, a vision of perfection carved in limestone over 3,000 years ago. This is Nefertiti, whose name means, "the beautiful one has come," and whose famous bust, discovered in 1912 by German archaeologist Ludwig Borchardt, has made her the most recognizable queen of ancient Egypt. But Nefertiti was far more than just a beautiful face. She was a revolutionary, a woman who helped to reshape Egyptian religion, politics, and culture. She was the wife of Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, who attempted to transform Egypt from a polytheistic society into a monotheistic one. And she may have been a pharaoh herself, ruling Egypt in her own right after her husband's death. Her story is one of the most fascinating and controversial in all of Egyptian history, a tale of religious revolution, political upheaval, and personal transformation that would have consequences lasting for centuries. Nefertiti appears in the historical record around 1353 BCE, when she married Amenhotep IV, a young prince who would soon become one of the most controversial pharaohs in Egyptian history. We know little about her background. She may have been a foreign princess, perhaps from Mitanni, or she may have been an Egyptian noblewoman. Some scholars even suggest that she may have been the daughter of I, a powerful courtier who would later become pharaoh himself. What we do know is that from the moment she became queen, Nefertiti was different from any royal wife who had come before her. In traditional Egyptian art, queens were depicted as secondary figures, standing behind their husbands, smaller in scale, clearly subordinate in status. But Nefertiti appears in reliefs and sculptures as an equal to her husband, sometimes even larger than him, clearly his partner rather than his subordinate. This equality becomes even more pronounced after Amenhotep IV changed his name to Akhenaten and launched his religious revolution. Akhenaten rejected the traditional Egyptian pantheon of gods and goddesses, declaring that there was only one true deity, the Aten, the disk of the sun. This was not just a religious change, it was a complete transformation of Egyptian society. For over 2,000 years, Egypt had been a polytheistic civilization, worshipping hundreds of gods and goddesses. The priesthood of these various deities controlled vast wealth and wielded enormous political power. By declaring that only the Aten was divine, Akhenaten was not just changing religious doctrine, he was launching a political revolution. And Nefertiti was his partner in this revolution. In the art of the Amarna period, as Akhenaten's reign is known, Nefertiti is depicted performing religious ceremonies that had traditionally been reserved for the pharaoh alone. She makes offerings to the Aten, she leads religious processions, she even appears to conduct rituals on her own authority. Most remarkably, she is sometimes shown wearing the blue crown of kingship, a piece of royal regalia that had never before been worn by a queen. This suggests that her role was not just ceremonial but genuinely political, that she was recognized as a co-ruler rather than just a royal wife. The religious revolution that Akhenaten and Nefertiti launched was radical beyond anything that had been attempted before in Egyptian history. They closed the temples of the old gods, disbanded their priesthoods, confiscated their wealth. They moved the capital of Egypt from Thebes to a new city called Akhenaten, horizon of the Aten, built in the middle of the desert in what is now known as Amarna. This new city was unlike anything that had existed before in Egypt. Instead of the dark, mysterious temples of the old religion, Akhenaten was filled with open-air sanctuaries where the Aten could shine down directly on his worshippers. Instead of the formal, stylized art of traditional Egypt, Amarna art was naturalistic, emotional, almost modern in its sensibility. And at the center of it all were Akhenaten and Nefertiti, depicted not as distant, godlike figures but as a loving family. The walls of Amarna are covered with scenes of the royal couple playing with their daughters, embracing each other, sharing intimate moments. This was revolutionary. Never before had Egyptian royal art depicted such personal, emotional scenes. But the revolution was not just artistic and religious, it was also political. By moving the capital to Amarna, Akhenaten and Nefertiti were removing themselves from the traditional power centers of Egypt. They were creating a new court, a new nobility, a new power structure that was loyal to them personally rather than to the old institutions. Nefertiti seems to have played a crucial role in this political transformation. She appears in scenes receiving tribute from foreign lands, suggesting that she was involved in diplomatic relations. She is depicted in military contexts, wearing the blue crown and carrying weapons, suggesting that she may have had some role in Egypt's military affairs. Most intriguingly, she appears in scenes that show her smiting Egypt's enemies, a motif that had traditionally been reserved for the pharaoh alone. This suggests that she was not just a queen but a warrior, a woman who was prepared to defend Egypt with force if necessary. But the Amarna revolution was not destined to last. The old priesthoods were too powerful, the traditional ways too deeply entrenched, the economic disruption too severe. After about 17 years of rule, Akhenaten disappeared from the historical record. He may have died, or he may have been overthrown, or he may have simply abdicated in favor of a successor. And this is where Nefertiti's story becomes truly mysterious. Around the time of Akhenaten's disappearance, a new pharaoh appears in the records, Nefertiti. This ruler is depicted wearing the full regalia of kingship, including the false beard that symbolized pharaonic authority. But the name Nefertiti was also one of Nefertiti's epithets, and some of the inscriptions associated with this pharaoh use feminine grammatical forms. Could Nefertiti have been Nefertiti herself, ruling as pharaoh in her own right? The evidence is tantalizing but inconclusive. Some reliefs show Nefertiti performing the traditional duties of a pharaoh, making offerings to the gods, receiving tribute from foreign lands, leading religious ceremonies. But the figure is often damaged or defaced, making it impossible to determine the ruler's gender with certainty. What we do know is that Nefertiti ruled for only a few years before disappearing from the records. The pharaoh was succeeded by Tutankhamun, the boy king who would restore the old religion and move the capital back to Thebes. But what happened to Nefertiti? Did she die during the chaos of the Amarna period? Was she murdered by opponents of the religious revolution? Did she retire to private life, abandoning her claims to power? Or did she continue to wield influence behind the scenes, perhaps as the power behind Tutankhamun's throne? We may never know the answers to these questions. Nefertiti's mummy has never been definitively identified, though some scholars believe it may be one of the unidentified female mummies found in the Valley of the Kings. Her tomb has never been found, though recent archaeological investigations have suggested that it may be hidden behind the walls of Tutankhamun's tomb. What we do know is that Nefertiti's legacy extended far beyond her own lifetime. The artistic revolution that she and Akhenaten launched had a lasting impact on Egyptian culture. The naturalistic, emotional style of Amarna art influenced Egyptian artists for generations to come. More importantly, Nefertiti's example showed that a woman could be more than just a royal wife. She could be a co-ruler, a religious leader, a political force in her own right. She could wear the crown of kingship, carry the symbols of pharaonic authority, command the loyalty of a nation. This was a lesson that would not be forgotten. Later queens would look to Nefertiti's example, would use her precedent to justify their own claims to power. She had shown that the barriers between male and female authority were not as absolute as they seemed, that a woman with sufficient will and political skill could transcend the limitations of her gender. But Nefertiti's story is also a cautionary tale about the fragility of power, especially for women in the ancient world. For all her influence, for all her apparent authority, she was ultimately dependent on her husband's support. When Akhenaten disappeared, her power disappeared with him. She could not maintain her position independently, could not create a lasting dynasty, could not ensure that her revolutionary changes would survive. This was the fundamental challenge facing all of Egypt's queens: how to wield power in a world that was fundamentally structured to exclude them. Some, like Hatshepsut, managed to rule for decades by transforming themselves into men. Others, like Nefertari, wielded influence through their relationships with powerful husbands. Still others, like Nefertiti, tried to reshape the very foundations of society. But none of them could completely overcome the structural barriers that limited women's power in the ancient world. They could achieve extraordinary things as individuals, but they could not create lasting institutional changes that would benefit other women. That limitation would become even more apparent in the story of Egypt's last great queen, a woman who would inherit a kingdom in decline and fight desperately to preserve it against the rising power of Rome. Her name was Cleopatra VII, and she would be the last pharaoh of Egypt, the final chapter in a story that had begun over 3,000 years earlier with the first unification of the two lands. But before we reach that final chapter, we must explore one of the darkest aspects of these queens' stories: the systematic attempt to erase them from history, to deny their achievements, to pretend that they had never existed at all. This is the story of how powerful men tried to rewrite history to exclude powerful women, and how modern archaeologists and historians are working to restore these lost queens to their rightful place in the annals of human achievement. In the shadow of Hatshepsut's great temple at Deir el-Bahari, a terrible crime was being committed. Not a crime of violence, not a crime of theft, but something far more insidious: the murder of memory itself. Across Egypt, in temples and tombs, on monuments and statues, the names and images of powerful women were being systematically destroyed. Chisels rang against stone as workers carved away hieroglyphs. Hammers shattered statues that had stood for centuries. Plaster covered reliefs that told the stories of queens and goddesses. This was not random vandalism. This was not the work of foreign invaders or religious fanatics. This was a deliberate, organized campaign to erase women from the history of Egypt, to pretend that they had never held power, never ruled kingdoms, never commanded the loyalty of millions. And it very nearly succeeded. The erasure of Egypt's queens was not a single event but a process that unfolded over centuries, driven by different motives and carried out by different people. But the result was always the same: the systematic removal of women from the official record of Egyptian history. The most famous victim of this erasure was Hatshepsut herself. For 22 years, she had ruled Egypt as pharaoh, wearing the false beard of kingship, commanding armies, building monuments that rivaled those of any male ruler. But within decades of her death, her name was being chiseled from king lists, her statues were being destroyed, her reliefs were being covered with plaster and painted over. For centuries, scholars believed that this erasure was the work of her stepson and successor, Thutmose III, seeking revenge against the woman who had usurped his throne. The story seemed to make sense: a bitter young man, finally free to rule in his own right, taking vengeance on the stepmother who had kept him from power for so long. But recent research has revealed a more complex and disturbing truth. The erasure of Hatshepsut was not the work of a single vengeful ruler but a systematic campaign that continued for generations, carried out by multiple pharaohs for reasons that had nothing to do with personal revenge. The evidence comes from careful analysis of when and how Hatshepsut's monuments were defaced. If Thutmose III had been seeking immediate revenge, we would expect to see the erasure beginning immediately after Hatshepsut's death. But that's not what happened. Instead, the erasure began decades later, during the reign of Amenhotep II, Thutmose III's son. And it continued under subsequent pharaohs, each adding their own contributions to the campaign of destruction. Why? What motivated this sustained effort to erase a pharaoh who had brought Egypt peace and prosperity? The answer lies in the fundamental challenge that Hatshepsut's reign posed to the Egyptian concept of kingship. The pharaoh was not just a political leader but a religious figure, the earthly incarnation of the god Horus. And Horus was male. By ruling as a female pharaoh, Hatshepsut had created a theological problem. She had disrupted the cosmic order, challenged the divine hierarchy, introduced an element of chaos into the carefully structured universe of Egyptian belief. Later pharaohs may have felt that this disruption needed to be corrected, that the memory of a female pharaoh needed to be erased in order to restore the proper cosmic balance. They were not seeking revenge, they were performing what they saw as a religious duty. But the erasure was not just about theology. It was also about politics. Hatshepsut's example was dangerous. If one woman could rule as pharaoh, others might try to follow her lead. The precedent she had set threatened the male monopoly on power that had been restored after her death. By erasing her from history, later pharaohs were trying to ensure that no other woman would be inspired by her example. They were attempting to make it seem as if female rule had never happened, that it was not even possible. The methods used to erase Hatshepsut were sophisticated and thorough. Her name was chiseled from king lists, replaced with the names of male predecessors or successors. Her cartouches, the oval symbols that enclosed royal names, were carved away from monuments and replaced with those of other pharaohs. Her statues were more problematic. These magnificent works of art, some of them colossal in size, could not simply be destroyed without attracting attention. Instead, they were carefully dismantled and buried, hidden away where they could not inspire dangerous thoughts about female power. Recent archaeological work at Deir el-Bahari has uncovered caches of these buried statues, broken into pieces but carefully preserved. Some show signs of deliberate damage, faces smashed, royal regalia removed, feminine features obliterated. But others seem to have been buried intact, as if the workers could not bring themselves to destroy such beautiful works of art. The discovery of these statues has provided new insights into the erasure process. It was not random destruction but careful, systematic removal. The goal was not to destroy Hatshepsut's monuments but to hide them, to remove them from public view while preserving them for, what? Posterity? Some future restoration? We may never know. But Hatshepsut was not the only victim of this campaign of erasure. Other powerful women suffered similar fates, their names and images removed from the historical record with varying degrees of success. Nefertiti, despite her fame today, was largely erased from Egyptian records after the fall of Amarna. Her name was removed from monuments, her images were defaced, her very existence was denied by later pharaohs who wanted to forget the religious revolution she had helped to lead. The gods' wives of Ammonius, despite their enormous power and influence, were systematically written out of later historical accounts. Their titles were transferred to male officials, their roles were diminished or eliminated entirely, their contributions to Egyptian religion and politics were forgotten. Even queens who had never ruled in their own right were not immune. Nefertari's beautiful tomb was sealed and forgotten, her correspondence with foreign rulers was ignored by later historians, her role in Ramesses II's diplomatic achievements was minimized or denied. The pattern was always the same: women's achievements were attributed to men, their roles were diminished, their very existence was questioned or denied. The goal was to create a version of Egyptian history in which women had never held real power, in which they had been decorative figures at best, invisible at worst. And for thousands of years, this revisionist history was accepted as truth. When European scholars first began to study ancient Egypt in the 18th and 19th centuries, they found a historical record that seemed to confirm their own prejudices about women's capabilities. Here was a great civilization that had apparently been ruled entirely by men, where women had played only supporting roles. The few references to powerful women that survived were dismissed as myths, legends, or misunderstandings. Hatshepsut was explained away as a regent who had briefly held power for her young stepson. Nefertiti was reduced to a beautiful face with no political significance. The gods' wives of Ammonius were ignored entirely. This interpretation of Egyptian history fit perfectly with 19th-century European ideas about gender roles. It confirmed the belief that women were naturally unsuited for leadership, that they had never held real power in any civilization, that their exclusion from politics was natural and inevitable. But the stones of Egypt told a different story. Hidden in tombs and buried in sand, covered by plaster and obscured by later additions, the evidence of women's power survived. It waited patiently for archaeologists and historians who would approach it with fresh eyes, who would question the assumptions of earlier scholars, who would be willing to see what had been hidden for so long. The rediscovery of Egypt's lost queens began in the 19th century, but it accelerated dramatically in the 20th and 21st centuries as new archaeological techniques and changing attitudes toward gender made it possible to see what had been there all along. The process was painstaking. Archaeologists had to carefully remove layers of plaster to reveal the original reliefs beneath. They had to piece together fragments of broken statues, matching pieces that had been scattered across different sites. They had to reinterpret inscriptions that had been deliberately altered or obscured. Most importantly, they had to overcome their own preconceptions about what they expected to find. For generations, scholars had approached Egyptian history with the assumption that women could not have held real power. When they found evidence to the contrary, they explained it away or ignored it entirely. But as more and more evidence accumulated, it became impossible to ignore the truth. Women had ruled Egypt. They had held real power, commanded armies, built monuments, shaped the course of history. The erasure had been extensive, but it had not been complete. Today, we can see the campaign of erasure for what it was: a deliberate attempt to rewrite history, to deny women's achievements, to create a false narrative that served the political and ideological needs of later rulers. But we can also see its ultimate failure. Despite centuries of systematic destruction, despite the best efforts of powerful men to erase them from history, the queens of Egypt have survived. Their stories have been recovered, their achievements have been recognized, their rightful place in history has been restored. The erasure of Egypt's queens was not just an ancient crime, it was a pattern that has been repeated throughout history, in every culture and every age. Powerful women have always been targets for those who would deny their achievements, minimize their contributions, erase them from the historical record. But the rediscovery of Egypt's lost queens gives us hope. It shows us that the truth has a way of surviving, even when it is buried beneath centuries of lies and propaganda. It reminds us that the stories of powerful women, no matter how thoroughly they are suppressed, have a way of rising from the sand, emerging from the shadows, demanding to be heard. And it challenges us to look more carefully at our own historical narratives, to question the assumptions we make about women's capabilities, to search for the lost queens in our own past who may have been erased by the prejudices of their time. The stones of Egypt have kept their secrets for thousands of years. But they are speaking now, telling us stories of women who defied the limitations of their time, who claimed power in a world that sought to deny it to them, who left legacies that no amount of erasure could completely destroy. These are the voices of the lost queens, rising from the sand, demanding to be heard, insisting on their rightful place in the story of human civilization. The year is 51 BCE. In the great harbor of Alexandria, the most magnificent city in the ancient world, a young woman of 18 is about to inherit a kingdom in crisis. Egypt, once the greatest power on earth, is now a shadow of its former self. The Romans control the Mediterranean, the Persians threaten from the east, and internal strife has weakened the once mighty kingdom of the Pharaohs. The Ptolemaic dynasty, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals, has ruled Egypt for 3 centuries, but their power is waning. Into this chaos steps Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, a woman whose intelligence, ambition, and political genius would make her one of the most famous rulers in history. But Cleopatra was not Egyptian. She was Greek, a descendant of Ptolemy I, who had claimed Egypt after Alexander's death. For 300 years, the Ptolemies had ruled Egypt as foreign overlords, adopting some Egyptian customs but maintaining their Greek identity and culture. Yet Cleopatra would be different. She would be the first Ptolemaic ruler to learn the Egyptian language, the first to truly embrace Egyptian culture, the first to present herself not just as a Greek queen but as a true pharaoh of Egypt. Her rise to power was not easy. According to Ptolemaic tradition, she was supposed to rule jointly with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. But Cleopatra had no intention of sharing power with a 10-year-old boy, especially one who was controlled by ambitious advisors who saw her as a threat. The conflict between the siblings quickly escalated into civil war. Cleopatra was forced to flee Egypt, taking refuge in Syria while her brother's forces controlled Alexandria. For a lesser person, this might have been the end of the story. But Cleopatra was not a lesser person. She was brilliant, speaking at least 9 languages fluently. She was educated in mathematics, philosophy, rhetoric, and history. She was politically astute, understanding the complex web of alliances and rivalries that shaped the Mediterranean world. And she was utterly ruthless when necessary, willing to do whatever it took to achieve her goals. Most importantly, she understood that Egypt's survival depended on finding a powerful ally. The kingdom was too weak to stand alone against the rising power of Rome. But if she could align herself with the right Roman leader, she might be able to preserve Egypt's independence and her own power. Her opportunity came in 48 BCE, when Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in pursuit of his rival Pompey. Caesar was the most powerful man in Rome, a military genius and political mastermind who had conquered Gaul and was now engaged in a civil war that would determine the future of the Roman Republic. Cleopatra knew that Caesar could be the key to her survival. But how could she approach him? Her brother's forces controlled the palace, and any attempt to meet with Caesar openly would likely result in her death. Her solution was audacious. According to the historian Plutarch, she had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence wrapped in a carpet. When the carpet was unrolled, out stepped the Queen of Egypt, ready to negotiate for her kingdom's future. The meeting was a success beyond Cleopatra's wildest dreams. Caesar was immediately captivated by her intelligence, her wit, her political acumen. Here was a woman who could match him intellectually, who understood the complexities of Mediterranean politics, who could be a true partner rather than just a subordinate ally. Their relationship quickly became both political and personal. Caesar helped Cleopatra defeat her brother and reclaim her throne. In return, she provided him with Egypt's vast wealth and resources. But their alliance was more than just a marriage of convenience, it was a genuine partnership between two of the most remarkable people of their age. Together, they had a son, Caesar Ion, whom Cleopatra claimed was Caesar's heir. They traveled together, lived together, planned together for a future in which Egypt and Rome would be united under their joint rule. But their dreams were shattered in 44 BCE when Caesar was assassinated in the Roman Senate. Cleopatra, who had been living in Rome as Caesar's mistress, was forced to flee back to Egypt, her position once again precarious. The Roman Republic was plunged into another civil war, this time between Caesar's assassins and his supporters. Eventually, three men emerged as the most powerful figures in Rome: Octavian, Caesar's adopted son and heir; Lepidus, a skilled politician; and Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant and a brilliant military commander. These three men formed the Second Triumvirate, dividing the Roman world among themselves. Antony received the eastern provinces, including Egypt, making him the most important Roman leader from Cleopatra's perspective. Once again, Cleopatra knew that her survival depended on aligning herself with the right Roman. And once again, she chose brilliantly. Mark Antony was in many ways the opposite of Caesar. Where Caesar had been calculating and controlled, Antony was passionate and impulsive. Where Caesar had been a political mastermind, Antony was primarily a military leader. But Antony had something that Caesar had lacked: he was genuinely sympathetic to Eastern culture and customs. Cleopatra's first meeting with Antony was even more theatrical than her encounter with Caesar. She sailed to meet him in a golden barge, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite, surrounded by attendants costumed as cupids and sea nymphs. The display was designed to overwhelm Antony's senses, to present Cleopatra not just as a queen but as a goddess. It worked. Antony was completely captivated, not just by Cleopatra's beauty but by her intelligence, her culture, her sophistication. Here was a woman who could discuss philosophy and poetry, who could plan military campaigns, who could govern a kingdom with skill and wisdom. Their relationship became one of the great love stories of history, but it was also a political alliance of enormous significance. Together, Cleopatra and Antony controlled the eastern Mediterranean, commanding vast armies and fleets, ruling over millions of people. They had 3 children together and planned to create a new empire that would unite the Greek, Roman, and Egyptian worlds. Antony divorced his Roman wife and married Cleopatra in an Egyptian ceremony. He declared their children to be his heirs and began distributing Roman territories to them. But their dreams of empire brought them into conflict with Octavian, who saw their alliance as a threat to Roman supremacy. The propaganda war between Octavian and Antony was vicious, with each side portraying the other as a traitor to Roman values. Octavian was particularly effective at demonizing Cleopatra, portraying her as a foreign seductress who had corrupted noble Roman men, as a threat to Roman civilization itself. He understood that Romans would be more willing to fight against a foreign queen than against one of their own generals. The conflict came to a head at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. Cleopatra and Antony commanded a massive fleet, but they were outmaneuvered by Octavian's admiral, Agrippa. When the battle turned against them, Cleopatra and Antony fled back to Egypt, their dreams of empire in ruins. Octavian pursued them to Alexandria, determined to eliminate the last threat to his power. Antony, believing that Cleopatra was dead, committed suicide. When Cleopatra learned of his death, she knew that her own fate was sealed. Octavian wanted to parade her through Rome as a captive, to display the defeated queen of Egypt as a trophy of his victory. But Cleopatra had one final card to play. She chose the manner of her own death, denying Octavian the satisfaction of humiliating her in public. According to legend, she allowed herself to be bitten by an asp, a cobra that was sacred to Egyptian royalty. In death, she became what she had always claimed to be, a true pharaoh of Egypt, choosing to die as a goddess rather than live as a prisoner. With Cleopatra's death in 30 BCE, the Ptolemaic dynasty came to an end. Egypt became a Roman province, its independence lost forever. The age of the pharaohs, which had lasted for over 3,000 years, was over. But Cleopatra's legacy lived on. She had shown that a woman could rule one of the world's great powers, could command armies and fleets, could negotiate with the most powerful men of her age as an equal. She had proven that intelligence and political skill were more important than gender in the game of power. More than that, she had preserved something of Egypt's ancient glory even in defeat. By presenting herself as a true pharaoh, by learning the Egyptian language and embracing Egyptian customs, she had connected the Ptolemaic dynasty to the great tradition of Egyptian kingship that stretched back to the first pharaohs. In many ways, Cleopatra was the culmination of the tradition of powerful Egyptian women that had begun with Nefertiti and Mernith over 3,000 years earlier. She was the last in a long line of queens who had proven that women could wield ultimate power, could rule kingdoms, could shape the course of history. But she was also the end of that tradition. With her death, Egypt lost its independence, and the opportunity for women to rule as pharaohs disappeared forever. The Roman Empire, and the Christian civilization that followed it, would have very different ideas about women's roles and capabilities. For over 1,000 years, the stories of Egypt's powerful queens would be forgotten, dismissed as myths or legends. The systematic erasure that had begun in ancient times would continue, as new rulers and new religions sought to create their own versions of history. But the stones of Egypt remembered. In tombs and temples, in statues and reliefs, in papyri and inscriptions, the evidence of women's power survived. It waited patiently for a new generation of scholars who would approach it with fresh eyes, who would be willing to see what had been hidden for so long. The rediscovery of Egypt's lost queens would be one of the great archaeological adventures of the modern age, a detective story that would span centuries and involve some of the most brilliant minds in the field of Egyptology. The year is 1922. In the Valley of the Kings, British archaeologist Howard Carter is about to make the most famous archaeological discovery in history. As he peers through a small hole in the sealed doorway of a tomb, holding a candle to illuminate the darkness within, he sees something that takes his breath away. "Can you see anything?" asks his patron, Lord Carnarvon, standing anxiously behind him. "Yes," Carter replies, his voice filled with wonder. "Wonderful things." The tomb of Tutankhamun would capture the world's imagination, revealing treasures of unimaginable beauty and value. But hidden among those treasures were clues to a larger story, hints of the powerful women who had shaped Egyptian history and then been erased from it. Carter's discovery marked the beginning of a new age in Egyptology, an age in which modern archaeological techniques and changing attitudes toward gender would make it possible to recover the lost stories of Egypt's queens. But the rediscovery of these women would not be easy. It would require decades of painstaking work, careful analysis of fragmentary evidence, and a willingness to challenge long-held assumptions about women's roles in the ancient world. One of the pioneers in this effort was a British Egyptologist named Joyce Tilsley, who in the late 20th century began to systematically study the evidence for female pharaohs. Her work revealed that far from being rare exceptions, women had ruled Egypt repeatedly throughout its long history. Tilsley's research showed that the traditional view of Egyptian kingship as an exclusively male institution was simply wrong. Women had not just served as regents or consorts, they had been pharaohs in their own right, wearing the false beard of kingship, commanding armies, building monuments that rivaled those of any male ruler. But perhaps the most important figure in the modern rediscovery of Egypt's queens has been Joanne Fletcher, a British Egyptologist whose work has revolutionized our understanding of women's roles in ancient Egypt. Fletcher's journey began with a fascination for Egyptian hair and wigs, a seemingly mundane topic that would lead her to some of the most important discoveries in modern Egyptology. By studying the elaborate hairstyles depicted in Egyptian art and found on mummies, Fletcher was able to identify specific individuals, trace family relationships, and uncover evidence of women's power that had been overlooked by previous scholars. Her most famous discovery came in the Valley of the Kings, where she identified a mummy that she believes to be Nefertiti herself. The mummy, known as the Younger Lady, had been found in 1898 but had remained unidentified for over a century. Fletcher's analysis of the mummy's skull structure, hair, and other physical characteristics convinced her that this was indeed the famous queen. The mummy showed signs of violence, a possible blow to the head that might have killed her, suggesting that Nefertiti may have met a violent end during the chaotic period following Akhenaten's death. While Fletcher's identification remains controversial, her work has highlighted the importance of looking at Egyptian mummies with fresh eyes, of questioning assumptions about gender and identity that have shaped Egyptology for generations. Fletcher's broader research has revealed the extent to which women's roles in ancient Egypt have been systematically underestimated. Her work on the gods' wives of Ammonius, for example, has shown that these women wielded far more power than previously recognized, controlling vast estates and commanding political influence that rivaled that of the pharaohs themselves. Her studies of female scribes have revealed that women played important roles in Egyptian intellectual life, serving not just as record keepers but as authors, poets, and scholars. Her analysis of tomb paintings and reliefs has shown that women participated in all aspects of Egyptian society, from religious ceremonies to business transactions to diplomatic negotiations. But Fletcher's most important contribution may be her work on the systematic erasure of women from Egyptian history. Her research has shown that this erasure was not accidental but deliberate, carried out by later rulers who wanted to deny women's achievements and create a false narrative of exclusively male rule. By carefully analyzing the patterns of damage to monuments and inscriptions, Fletcher and other scholars have been able to reconstruct the process by which women were written out of history. They have shown how names were chiseled away, how statues were buried or destroyed, how reliefs were covered with plaster and painted over. But they have also shown that the erasure was not complete. Hidden beneath layers of plaster, buried in forgotten caches, scattered across different sites, the evidence of women's power has survived. It has taken modern archaeological techniques, X-ray analysis, computer modeling, DNA testing, to recover this evidence and piece together the true story of Egypt's queens. The work continues today. In laboratories around the world, scientists are using cutting-edge technology to analyze Egyptian mummies, looking for clues to their identity, their relationships, their causes of death. In Egypt itself, archaeologists are still making new discoveries, uncovering tombs and monuments that shed new light on women's roles in ancient society. One of the most exciting recent discoveries has been the tomb of Hatshepsut, a previously unknown queen from the Middle Kingdom. Her tomb, discovered in 2017, contained inscriptions that revealed her to be a powerful ruler in her own right, not just the wife of a pharaoh but a pharaoh herself. Another important discovery has been the identification of female pharaohs in the archaeological record through new analysis of existing evidence. Scholars have re-examined inscriptions, reliefs, and artifacts with fresh eyes, looking for signs of female rule that were previously overlooked or misinterpreted. The use of new technologies has been particularly important in this process. Ground-penetrating radar has revealed hidden chambers in tombs that may contain evidence of female burials. CT scans of mummies have revealed details about their lives, deaths, and identities that were previously unknowable. DNA analysis has made it possible to trace family relationships and identify specific individuals with unprecedented accuracy. But perhaps the most important development has been the changing attitudes toward gender that have made it possible for scholars to see what was always there. For generations, Egyptologists approached their subject with the assumption that women could not have held real power in the ancient world. When they found evidence to the contrary, they explained it away or ignored it entirely. Today's scholars approach the evidence with different assumptions. They are willing to consider the possibility that women did hold power, that they did rule kingdoms, that they did shape the course of history. This change in perspective has made it possible to see patterns and connections that were previously invisible. The rediscovery of Egypt's lost queens is not just an academic exercise, it has important implications for our understanding of women's capabilities and potential. These ancient women prove that female leadership is not a modern invention, that women have always been capable of wielding ultimate power when given the opportunity. Their stories challenge the narrative that has dominated Western civilization for centuries, the idea that women are naturally unsuited for leadership, that their exclusion from power is natural and inevitable. The queens of Egypt show us that this narrative is false, that it is based on prejudice rather than evidence. But the rediscovery of these women also reveals the extent to which history has been distorted by the systematic exclusion of women's voices and experiences. For thousands of years, the stories of powerful women have been suppressed, denied, erased from the record. Only now are we beginning to recover these lost stories and understand their true significance. The work of scholars like Joanne Fletcher and others is not just about the past, it is about the future. By recovering the stories of Egypt's lost queens, they are providing role models for contemporary women, showing them that female leadership has a long and distinguished history. They are also challenging all of us to look more carefully at our own historical narratives, to question the assumptions we make about women's capabilities, to search for the lost queens in our own past who may have been erased by the prejudices of their time. The stones of Egypt have kept their secrets for thousands of years. But they are speaking now, telling us stories that challenge everything we thought we knew about women, power, and history. These are the voices of the lost queens, rising from the sand, demanding to be heard, insisting on their rightful place in the story of human civilization. And their message is clear: women have always been capable of greatness. They have always been able to lead, to rule, to shape the world around them. The only thing that has changed is our willingness to recognize and celebrate their achievements. The lost queens of Egypt are lost no more. They have been found, their stories have been recovered, their legacies have been restored. And in their rediscovery, we find not just the past but the future, a future in which women's potential is recognized, their achievements are celebrated, and their voices are heard. We stand now at the end of our journey through the sands of time, having walked with queens and goddesses, having witnessed the rise and fall of empires, having seen the eternal struggle between power and prejudice, between achievement and erasure. But this is not just a story about the past. This is a story about us, about our world, about the choices we make and the legacies we leave behind. The queens of ancient Egypt speak to us across the millennia, their voices carrying lessons that are as relevant today as they were 5,000 years ago. They remind us that the desire for power, for recognition, for the chance to shape the world, is not limited by gender. They show us that women have always been capable of greatness, that they have always possessed the intelligence, the courage, the vision necessary to lead. But they also show us something else: how fragile these achievements can be, how easily they can be erased, how quickly the world can forget that they ever existed at all. Think about Hatshepsut, who ruled Egypt for 22 years, who brought peace and prosperity to her people, who built monuments that still inspire awe today. For centuries, she was forgotten, her name chiseled from monuments, her statues buried in the sand. It was only through the painstaking work of modern archaeologists that her story was recovered, her achievements recognized, her rightful place in history restored. How many other Hatshepsuts have been lost to history? How many women throughout the ages have achieved greatness only to be forgotten, their stories erased by those who could not accept that a woman could wield such power? The systematic erasure of Egypt's queens was not unique to the ancient world. It is a pattern that has been repeated throughout history, in every culture, in every age. Powerful women have always been targets for those who would deny their achievements, minimize their contributions, erase them from the historical record. Even today, in our supposedly enlightened age, we see echoes of this ancient prejudice. Women's achievements are still questioned, their capabilities still doubted, their contributions still minimized. The glass ceiling may have cracks in it, but it has not been shattered completely. But the queens of Egypt give us hope. They show us that progress is possible, that barriers can be broken, that women can achieve anything they set their minds to. They remind us that the fight for equality is not a modern invention but an ancient struggle that has been going on for millennia. Consider the lessons we can learn from these remarkable women. From Peshet, the first known female physician, we learn that knowledge has no gender. Her mastery of medicine, her leadership of other female doctors, her service to the royal family, all of this happened over 4,000 years ago, in a world that we often assume was completely dominated by men. She reminds us that women have always been capable of intellectual achievement, that they have always been able to master complex knowledge and use it to help others. From the gods' wives of Amun, we learn that spiritual authority can be a source of real power. These women wielded enormous influence not through military might or political maneuvering, but through their connection to the divine. They remind us that there are many different forms of power, many different ways to shape the world around us. From Hatshepsut, we learn that sometimes the only way to break barriers is to transform ourselves completely. Her adoption of masculine regalia, her transformation from queen to king, her willingness to challenge every assumption about gender and power, all of this required enormous courage and determination. She reminds us that progress often requires sacrifice, that breaking barriers is never easy, that sometimes we must be willing to become something new in order to achieve our goals. From Nefertari, we learn that love and power can coexist, that a woman can be both beloved and respected, both romantic partner and political equal. Her relationship with Ramesses II shows us that the best partnerships are based on mutual respect and genuine affection, that true love enhances rather than diminishes our capacity for achievement. From Nefertiti, we learn that beauty and intelligence are not mutually exclusive, that a woman can be both admired for her appearance and respected for her mind. Her role in the Amarna revolution shows us that women can be agents of change, that they can help to reshape society, that they can be partners in the most radical transformations. From Cleopatra, we learn that intelligence and political skill can overcome almost any disadvantage. Despite being a foreign ruler in a time of crisis, despite facing the might of Rome, despite the prejudices of her age, she managed to preserve Egypt's independence for decades through sheer force of will and political genius. She reminds us that leadership is not about gender but about capability, that the best leaders are those who can adapt to changing circumstances and find creative solutions to impossible problems. But perhaps the most important lesson we can learn from these women is about the power of memory itself. Their stories survive not because they were perfectly preserved but because people cared enough to remember them, to search for them, to piece together the fragments of their lives from scattered evidence. The modern scholars who have recovered these stories, archaeologists like Howard Carter, historians like Joyce Tilsley, Egyptologists like Joanne Fletcher, have shown us that the past is not fixed, that history is not a closed book. They have demonstrated that with enough dedication, enough skill, enough willingness to challenge assumptions, we can recover lost voices, restore forgotten achievements, give credit where credit is due. This work is not just about the past, it is about the future. Every time we recover the story of a forgotten woman, every time we recognize an achievement that was previously ignored, every time we challenge the narrative that excludes women from positions of power, we make it a little easier for the next generation of women to achieve their goals. The queens of Egypt remind us that representation matters, that seeing examples of female leadership can inspire others to follow in their footsteps. When young girls learn about Hatshepsut's 22-year reign, when they see images of Nefertiti wearing the crown of kingship, when they read about Cleopatra's political genius, they begin to understand that leadership is not just for men. But these ancient queens also remind us of our responsibilities. We who live in an age of unprecedented opportunity, who have access to education and resources that these ancient women could never have imagined, have an obligation to use our advantages wisely. We must not take for granted the freedoms that we enjoy, the opportunities that are available to us, the progress that has been made. These things were not inevitable, they were achieved through the struggles of countless women throughout history, many of whose names we will never know. We must also remember that the fight is not over. Despite all the progress that has been made, women still face barriers, still encounter prejudice, still find their achievements questioned and their capabilities doubted. The glass ceiling may have cracks in it, but it has not been completely shattered. The queens of Egypt remind us that progress is not linear, that achievements can be lost as well as gained, that the fight for equality must be fought anew in every generation. They show us that vigilance is the price of freedom, that we must always be ready to defend the gains that have been made and to push for further progress. But they also give us hope. They show us that change is possible, that barriers can be broken, that women can achieve anything they set their minds to. They remind us that we are part of a long tradition of strong, capable, determined women who have refused to accept limitations, who have pushed boundaries, who have changed the world. The voices of the lost queens echo across the centuries, carrying a message of empowerment and inspiration. They tell us that we are capable of greatness, that we have the power to shape our own destinies, that we can leave legacies that will inspire future generations. They remind us that we are not just individuals struggling alone but part of a sisterhood that stretches back to the dawn of civilization. We are connected to Peshet and her medical knowledge, to Hatshepsut and her political courage, to Nefertari and her diplomatic skill, to Nefertiti and her revolutionary vision, to Cleopatra and her intellectual brilliance. Their achievements are our inheritance. Their struggles are our inspiration. Their legacies are our responsibility. The queens of Egypt have shown us what is possible. Now it is up to us to make it real. And so we return to where we began, to the dark corridors of an ancient temple, to the glowing hieroglyphs that hold the secrets of the ages, to the whispered voices that speak across the millennia. But now we understand what those voices are saying. Now we can hear the stories they have been trying to tell us, the truths they have been waiting for us to discover. In a land ruled by gods and kings, rose women who defied time. Their names were buried, but we have found them. Their power was erased, but we have restored it. Their stories were forgotten, but we remember them now. We remember Nefertiti, the first queen, whose tomb was so grand that archaeologists mistook it for that of a king. We remember Mernith, whose name appears on the sacred Serek, who may have been the first woman to rule Egypt in her own right. We remember Peshet, the world's first known female physician, who supervised other women doctors when most of the world believed that women could not even learn to read. We remember the gods' wives of Ammonius, who wielded power that rivaled that of the pharaohs themselves, who served as the earthly brides of the king of the gods. We remember Hatshepsut, who wore the false beard of kingship for 22 years, who transformed herself from woman to man and back again, who proved that gender was no barrier to effective rule. We remember Nefertari, the beloved of Ramesses the Great, whose tomb is a love letter written in stone, whose diplomatic correspondence shows us a woman who was both romantic partner and political equal. We remember Nefertiti, the beautiful one who came, whose revolutionary vision helped to reshape Egyptian religion and culture, who may have ruled as pharaoh in her own right. We remember Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, whose intelligence and political genius preserved her kingdom's independence for decades against impossible odds. We remember all of them, these queens and goddesses, these healers and diplomats, these revolutionaries and rulers. We remember their achievements, their struggles, their triumphs, their defeats. But most of all, we remember their courage. The courage to dream of power in a world that sought to deny it to them. The courage to claim authority in societies that believed women were incapable of leadership. The courage to leave legacies that would inspire future generations, even knowing that those legacies might be erased. They were not perfect. They made mistakes, faced failures, sometimes fell short of their goals. But they persevered. They refused to accept the limitations that others tried to impose on them. They dared to imagine a different world, and then they worked to make that world real. Their stories remind us that the desire for power, for recognition, for the chance to shape the world, is not a modern phenomenon. It is as old as humanity itself. And in ancient Egypt, for a brief, shining moment in history, that desire was not limited by gender. The queens of Egypt opened doors that could never be completely closed. They created precedents that would inspire women for generations to come. They showed that power, true power, has no gender. Today, their voices rise from the sand, their faces emerge from the shadows of history, their stories demand to be heard. They speak to us across the millennia, carrying messages of hope and inspiration, of courage and determination, of the eternal power of the human spirit to overcome any obstacle. They remind us that we are all capable of greatness, that we all have the power to change the world, that we all can leave legacies that will inspire future generations. The temple corridors are no longer dark. The hieroglyphs no longer hide their secrets. The whispered voices have become a chorus of triumph, a song of empowerment, a hymn to the eternal strength of women throughout history. In a land ruled by gods and kings, rose women who defied time. Their names were buried. Their power, erased. But they are buried no longer. They are erased no more. They live on in stone, in story, in spirit. They live on in every woman who dares to dream of power, who refuses to accept limitations, who believes that she can change the world. They live on in us. The lost queens of Egypt are lost no more.